After a long journey from Missouri, Clara Mayhew was left abandoned. In the muddy street, her intended husband, sneering, "This ain't what was promised." Humiliated and alone, she braced for a future with no hope. But then a deep voice cut through the crowd's mocking whispers. It was Amos Hargrove, the reclusive mountain man, a stranger to them all. He didn't offer pity, he offered a vow. "Be my wife instead." The company's men were on their way. The law wouldn't wait, and the only hope lay in a man the world had forgotten. If they could reach him before the snows closed in, every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story. The late afternoon wind whipped scattered snowflakes across the muddy street as Clara Mayhew descended the stagecoach. Steps her fingers numb despite her worn gloves clutched her carpet bag close. The journey from Missouri had been long, but hope had kept her warm. Hope that had withered the moment Richard Dalton's expression shifted from expectation to disgust. "This ain't what was promised in them letters," Dalton announced, his voice carrying across the gathered townsfolk. "You ain't near as well favored as you made yourself out to be." Clara's cheeks burned hotter than the winter cold could account for. The careful words they'd exchanged over months of correspondence crumbled like dead leaves. She watched, heart sinking, as her trunk thumped onto the slushy ground. The stagecoach driver already turning away. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "Poor thing," someone murmured. "Come all this way for nothing." Another voice. "Shame on Dalton, treating her so." But no one stepped forward. No one offered help. Clara straightened her spine, though her legs trembled beneath her heavy skirts. The ticket home, she had spent every penny she had just getting here. Her seamstress's savings, carefully hoarded over 3 years, had bought her a one-way passage, and what she'd thought would be a fresh start. "I suppose I'll need directions to the boarding house," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. But before anyone could answer, movement drew her attention to the edge of the crowd. A tall man stepped forward, his worn buffalo coat dusted. With snow unlike the other onlookers, his weathered face showed no pity, only quiet dignity and something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. Clara recognized him from the stagecoach's approach. He'd been standing apart from the others, as if the town's bustle was foreign to him. "Be my wife instead." His voice was deep and soft, as distant thunder, yet it carried clearly in the hushed street. The words weren't flowery or elaborate, just for simple syllables that changed everything. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Clara looked up into eyes the color of mountain lakes, steady and deep. His face was lined by sun and weather. His dark beard shot through with silver, but there was strength in his bearing and kindness in the way he held out his hand. "I'm Amos Hargrove," he said, as if proposing marriage to a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. "Got a cabin up valley. It ain't fancy, but it's warm and solid built." Clara's heart pounded. This wasn't how she'd imagined her arrival. Wasn't the future she'd planned. But there was something in Amos Hargrove's quiet offer that spoke to her. Salola respect that Dalton's superficial courtship had never shown. She heard Dalton scoff behind her. "The mountain man, you'd be better off heading back east." Miss Clara lifted her chin. "I'm not going back," she said, and placed her hand in Amos's larger one. His grip was warm and sure, calloused from work, but gentle in the way he held her fingers. "Reckon we should see Reverend Hayes," Amos said, and there was the faintest smile in his voice. He turned to the driver, who was preparing to leave. "That trunk needs loading in my wagon." The sun was already sliding toward the mountains when they stood before the altar in the simple wooden church. Clara's traveling dress was creased from the journey, and Amos' coat still carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. But Reverend Hayes asked no questions about their hasty ceremony, only opened his Bible with careful hands. A few townspeople had followed, perhaps curious, perhaps concerned. Their whispers echoed in the empty pews, but Clara focused on the steady presence beside her. On the way, Amos stood straight and respectful as the Reverend spoke of duty and devotion. When it came time for the vows, Amos's voice never wavered. "I do," he said, clear and certain. Clara's own response was softer, but no less sure. The ring he produced was a simple gold band worn from his pocket. "Sarid, may God bless this union," Reverend Hayes concluded, closing his Bible with quiet finality. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the church's western window, painting the rough walls with amber and rose. Clara looked up at the man who was now her husband, this stranger who had offered sanctuary. When she needed it most, his eyes met hers, and in them she saw not passion or infatuation, but something rarer, respect, and perhaps the seed of understanding that might grow into something deeper. "Ready to head home?" Amos asked softly. Home. Such a simple word, but it held worlds of meaning. Clara nodded, and together they stepped out of the church into the gathering dusk. The wagon wheels creaked as Amos helped Clara up onto the wooden seat. Her trunk and belongings were secured in the back, nestled among sacks of flour beans and other winter provisions. The late afternoon sky had deepened to pewter, promising more snow before nightfall. Clara settled her skirts, acutely aware of the stranger beside her, her husband now, though she barely knew his name. Amos handled the reins with practiced ease, clicking softly to the matched pair of bay horses. They moved first toward the livery stable, its weathered boards dark against the winter sky. The livery keeper emerged from the shadows of the barn, a lean man with strands of hay clinging to his vest. His eyes moved from Amos to Clara, then back again, curiosity plain on his face. But he said nothing, merely nodded as he measured out oats for the team. "Extra measure," Amos said, his voice low. "Long climb ahead," the keeper added another scoop. Without comment, though, Clara caught him watching her from the corner of his eye. She kept her spine straight, fighting the urge to shrink from his scrutiny. She'd had enough of being studied for one day. They left town behind the wagon's wheels, crunching through patches of old snow. The temperature dropped as shadows lengthened across the valley. Amos pulled a heavy buffalo robe from behind the seat and draped it over Clara's lap. "Trail gets rough past the creek," he said, reaching for the lantern hung at the wagon side. The flames sputtered to life, casting a small circle of warmth in the gathering dark. But the horses know the way. The creek crossing loomed ahead, ice gleaming dully in the lantern light. Amos stepped down, testing the surface with his boot before leading the team forward. The horses' hooves crunched through the frozen crust water, gurgling beneath. Clara gripped the seat as the wagon swayed over hidden ruts. Amos' steady hand on the res and quiet words to the horses guided them safely across. He climbed back up, bringing with him the sharp scent of pine and cold air. The wagon began to climb, following a narrow track that wound between dark stands of timber. The journey seemed endless in the dark, marked only by the steady clip of hooves and the lantern's swaying light. Finally, the trees opened into a small clearing. Clara made out the bulk of a cabin, solid and dark against the star-filled sky. A barn stood to one side, its roof laden with snow. Amos helped her down, then led the horses toward the barn. "Make yourself welcome," he said, pressing the cabin key into her hand. "I'll see to the team." Clara's fingers trembled slightly as she fitted the key to the lock. The door opened with a soft groan of iron hinges. Inside, darkness pressed close until she found matches on the mantel and lit the lamp waiting there. Cabin's single room gradually emerged from shadow. A stone hearth dominated one wall. Iron cookpots hanging ready. A table and chairs stood beneath the window. A hutch beside them holding dishes. 2 doors led to what must be bedrooms. Everything was plain but clean. The floor swept and the windows free of dust. The crunch of boots announced Amos's return. He moved straight to the hearth, stacking wood with practiced motions. Soon flames caught and grew, sending welcome warmth through the space. Clara stood awkwardly unsure of her place in the stranger's home. Amos straightened, brushing wood, dust from his hands. "Your room's through there," he said, indicating the right-hand door. "Bed's made up fresh. Extra quilt in the chest if you need it." "Chest if you need it." Clara nodded, clutching her carpet bag closer. Amos's eyes softened at her obvious nervousness. "I know this ain't what you expected coming out here," he said quietly. "Reckon you need time to settle in. I can sleep in the lean-to till you're more comfortable. Got it fixed up warm enough." The offer eased something tight in Clara's chest. "Thank you," she whispered. Amos brought in her trunk, setting it carefully beside her door. Then he fetched the extra quilt, thick with intricate stitching, and laid it across her bed. The room was small but neat, with a braided rug beside the bed and curtains at the window. "Sleep well, Mrs. Hargrove," he said, and left her alone with her thoughts. Clanged into her nightgown, the fabric cool against her skin. She lay in the strange bed, pulling both quilts up to her chin. The cabin creaked softly as it settled, and wind whispered through the pines outside. Above her, rough hewn beams crossed the ceiling, still bearing the marks of the axe that had shaped them. What kind of man had she married? One who offered marriage to a stranger, yet gave her space when she needed it. One who lived alone in these mountains, yet kept curtains in the spare room and extra quilts in the chest. Outside, Amos made one final check of the barn's latch, ensuring all was secure for the night. His breath fogged in the cold air as he turned back toward the cabin. Light glowed softly behind Clara's window, a warm beacon in the darkness. He stood for a moment watching that light before retiring to the Leonto's simple comfort. Clara woke to pale sunlight streaming through her window and the rich aroma of coffee drifting under her door. The cabin's main room was warm, the hearth already stoked to life. Amos stood at the stove, his broad shoulders wrapped in a heavy wool coat. "Morning," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup. "Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." Clara accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. "Need to fetch water before breakfast," Amma said, reaching for a wooden bucket. "Show you the path to the creek." Clara pulled on her heaviest coat and followed him. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean, making her gasp. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, turning the world pristine white. Amos broke trail ahead of her, his boots cutting deep into the drifts. The creek lay a good 10-minute walk through the trees. Snow caught at Clara's skirts, soaking the hem despite her best efforts to lift them. By the time they reached the water, her legs were wet to the knees. "Creek don't freeze here," Amos explained, pointing to where dark water moved swift between ice-crusted banks. "Spring feeds it year-round." He demonstrated how to break through the thin shore ice to reach the flowing water beneath. Back at the cabin, Clara changed her wet stockings, while Amos built up the fire. The morning settled into a quiet rhythm as she unpacked her trunk, hanging dresses, and arranging her few belongings. Amos worked nearby, fitting a new strip of leather around a drafty window to keep out the wind. When hunger gnawed, Clara found cornmeal in the pantry and stirred up a pot of mush. The familiar motions felt good, something useful she could do. She added a generous spoonful of molasses before serving 2 steaming bowls. "Much obliged," Amos said simply, but his appreciation showed in how thoroughly he cleaned his bowl. Their conversation over the meal stayed sparse, but cordial, focused on practical matters like where things were stored and daily routines. Clara found herself studying his hands as he talked, strong and capable, yet gentle, when handling delicate window glass or passing her the salt cellar. After supper, Amos carried in an armload of logs and set them by the hearth. "Best learn to split kindling," he said. "Never know when you might need to start a fire yourself." He showed her how to hold the knife safely, demonstrating the right angle to split the wood along its grain. Clara noticed how carefully he explained each step, never assuming she couldn't learn or treating her like a child. When she managed to split a piece cleanly, his quiet "well done" meant more than elaborate praise might have. The days that followed fell into a steady pattern. Mornings meant hauling water, feeding chickens, and other essential chores. Afternoons, Clara spent mending clothes or helping preserve game that Amos brought home. While he checked his trap lines or repaired equipment, a week into their unusual marriage, Amos asked if she'd like to see his beaver sets. Clara agreed eagerly, glad for a change in routine. They set out on snowshoes, Amos showing her how to walk with the strange contraptions strapped to her boots. The frozen pond lay still and white under the winter sky. Amos explained how he chose spots to set his traps, pointing out the signs of beaver activity along the shore. Clara found herself genuinely interested in his knowledge of the animal's habits. On their return journey, a sharp crack split the air. Amos stumbled as one of his snowshoe straps snapped clean through. He caught himself before falling, but the look of surprise on his usually stoic face struck Clara as funny. A giggle escaped before she could stop it. Amos looked up at her startled, then his mouth curved into an unexpected smile that transformed his whole face. Soon they were both laughing, the sound echoing off the snow-laden trees. Clara couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed so freely. That evening, Clara served up a thick stew of venison in dried vegetables. They ate in what had become their usual quiet, but the silence felt different now, comfortable rather than strained. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the table, and the memory of shared laughter would flutter between them like a warming flame. Clara studied Amos as he finished his meal. The mountain man who'd offered marriage to a stranger was slowly becoming real to her, a person with his own habits and humor, who taught with patience and smiled with his whole face when caught off guard. She was beginning to understand that respect given and received might be the finest foundation for whatever lay ahead. The morning dawned bitter cold 2 weeks after their wedding. Clara had just pulled fresh biscuits from the oven when hoofbeat tats echoed through the valley. She peered out the window to see a rider in a dark blue railroad coat making his way up the snowy path to their cabin. Amos opened the door before the man could knock. "Can I help you?" "Message for Amos Hardrove?" the writer said, pulling a thick envelope from his satchel. The paper bore an official-looking seal, the Denver and Pacific Railroad emblem pressed into red wax. Dr. Clara watched Amos's face as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. His expression hardened as he read, then read again. Without a word, he handed the paper to Clara. Her hands trembled as she took in the formal language. The railroad claimed their land for a new line planned to run through the valley. According to their records, Amos's title was invalid. They had until spring thaw to vacate the property. But ... how can they do this? Clara's voice shook. "This is your home." The writer had already turned his horse back to Wart Town, leaving them alone with the devastating news. Amos sank into a chair by the fire, his shoulders heavy. "My claim was different than most," he said, finally staring into the flames. "Years back, I did guide work for the government. Translation 2, helping settle matters between the Ute and the Indian agent." He rubbed his weathered hands together. "Agent Hammond promised me this land in exchange. Said the papers would come later, and they never did." Amos shook his head. "Hammond died that winter. Never did get anything in writing." His voice grew quiet. "Didn't seem important then. The youth knew it was fair payment for my help. Nobody else wanted this high valley." Clara set the letter on the table, noting how the official letterhead seemed to mock their simple cabin. Everything they had, the barn Amos had built himself. The garden plot she'd already started planning for spring. The root cellar stocked with preserved food, all of it could be taken away. "We should go to town," she said, mind racing. "Surely someone there can help." "The minister, or maybe town's near 20 members from good weather," Amos cut in. "Trail's dangerous now with the snow, would take precious money we might need later." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the land he'd worked for so many years. "Besides, ain't likely anyone there can help against the railroad." That night, neither of them ate much supper. The biscuits sat forgotten and cold on the counter. Clara tried to work on her mending, but her stitches came out crooked. Amos cleaned his rifle with mechanical movements, his thoughts clearly far away. The next morning, Clara woke to find Amos already gone, his breakfast barely touched. Through the frost-edged window, she watched him checking his trap lines with fierce determination. He worked until well past dark, returning with an armload of pelts that he cleaned and stretched with painstaking care. "Good beaver here," he said, as he worked the first words he'd spoken all day. "Might get decent price come spring." His hands moved steadily, treating each pelt as if it might be the one to save their home. Clara watched him from her seat by the fire, her heart aching. In just 2 weeks, she'd grown attached to this quiet cabin and the steady man who shared it. The thought of losing it all made her chest tight with worry. "We'll figure something out," she said softly, though she wasn't sure Amos heard her over. The scraping of his tools against the pelts. He worked late into the night, the lamplight casting his shadow large against the cabin wall. Each pelt he hung to dry represented hope. Hope that somehow they could earn enough to fight the railroads. Claim hope that their simple life wouldn't be torn away when the snow melted. When the snow melted. Clara added an extra log to the fire and made a fresh pot of coffee. It was the only help she could offer right now. But as she watched Amos methodically prepare the furs, she silently promised herself she would find a way to do more. This land wasn't just Amos's home anymore. It was becoming hers too. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying the first hints of another snowstorm. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and beaver pelts, while Amos worked with single-minded focus, as if he could trap his way to security. One pelt at a time, Clara refused to let the railroad's threat crush her spirit. As dawn broke the next morning, she tied on her apron with fresh determination. The cabin might not be hers for long, but she would make it a home for whatever time they had. She mixed flour and yeast in her mother's old pottery bowl, kneading the dough with practiced hands. The familiar motions soothed her worried mind. While the bread rose near the hearth, she bundled up in her warmest shawl and made her way to the chicken coop. The hens clucked grumpily at being disturbed so early, but Clara spoke to them softly. As she gathered eggs from the nests, they're now ladies. These will make a fine breakfast. The simple task reminded her of helping her grandmother as a child, bringing comfort in its routine. Back inside, she found Amos pulling on his boots by the door. He paused, inhaling deeply. "Smells good in here. Fresh bread will be ready by supper," she said, setting the egg basket on the table. "And I noticed your shirts could use some attention." She gestured to the pile of mending she'd gathered. Amos glanced down at his worn cuff, as if seeing the frayed edges for the first time. "Reckon they could at that." He hesitated by the door. "Might be good to have company checking the trap lines today if you're interested." Clara's heart lifted at the invitation. "I'd like that very much." They walked together through the crisp morning air, their boots crunching in the fresh snow. Amos pointed out subtle signs she would have missed a depression here. A scattered tuft of fur there. "See there?" He crouched down, pointing to faint marks in the snow. "Fox tracks," noticed how they make almost a straight line. "That's different from a dog's meandering trail." Clara knelt beside him, studying the delicate prints like they know exactly where they're going. "Smart creatures," Amos nodded. "Have to be smarter to catch them." The lessons continued each day that week. Clara found herself looking forward to their morning walks, both for the quiet companionship and the growing knowledge of the land she now called home. When Sunday arrived, Amos surprised her by suggesting they attend church. "Weather's fair enough for the wagon," he said over breakfast. "Might do us good to hear the word." Clara agreed eagerly, though. Butterflies fluttered in her stomach as they hitched up the team. This would be their first time in town as a married couple. The little church's bell was ringing as they pulled up. Clara Ara smoothed her best dress, conscious of curious eyes watching their arrival. But when she stepped down from the wagon, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She might not be what they expected of Amos Hargrove's wife, but she would show them her worth. "Welcome. Welcome." The minister's wife hurried over. "So pleased to see you both." Her smile seemed genuine, though her eyes held questions. Clara met each introduction with genuine warmth, sharing recipes with one woman and commiserating about the harsh winter with another. When time came to prepare after-service coffee, she rolled up her sleeves and stepped in to help, measuring grounds with the precision her father's cafe had taught her. "My, that's the best coffee we've had since Martha moved away," one elder declared, and several others nodded agreement. Clara felt a small glow of pride. The pastor took time to pray with them privately after the service, his words bringing comfort. "The Lord guides us in mysterious ways," he reminded them. "Sometimes what seems like a closed door leads to an open window." On the ride home, Amos seemed more relaxed than Clara had seen him since the railroad letter arrived. He even hummed a bit of the morning's hymn as they crossed the creek. That evening, Clara sat in her usual spot by the fire, mending one of Amos's shirts. The flames crackled softly, and outside an owl called into the gathering dark. She looked up to find Amos watching her from his chair. "Cabin feels different now," he said quietly. "Warmer." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure if he meant the actual temperature or something more. She bent her head back to her stitching, but a small smile played at her lips. The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with the soft sounds of needle through fabric and wood settling in the fire. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Clara knew they would face them together. For now, that was enough. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cabin's small windows as Clara climbed the narrow ladder to the loft. A cold snap had settled over the valley, and she hoped to find extra quilts among the stored items above. The rough-hewn beams creaked under her careful steps as she made her way to the cedar chest tucked beneath the sloping roof. The chest's hinges groaned as she lifted the heavy lid. The familiar scent of cedar wood rose up, mingled with memories stored away. Clara's hands moved methodically through the folded blankets and quilts, each worn soft with age. Near the bottom, her fingers brushed something wrapped in stiff oilcloth, tucked away between layers of fabric. Curious, she drew out the packet. It was tied with faded twine, the knots pulled tight by years of storage. Working them loose, she unfolded the oilcloth carefully. Inside lay yellowed papers and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map, its ink lines faded, but still clear. Her heart quickened as she examined the document beneath. Written in careful script was a deed, the handwriting precise despite its age. At the bottom were two signatures, one in English showing the name of a U chief and another from someone titled Indian Agent. The paper bore dates and descriptions of the very land they now lived on. "Amos!" She called, her voice trembling with excitement. "Amos, come quick!" His boots thundered up the ladder moments later. "What is it?" he asked, ducking his head under the low beams. "Look what I found." Clara held out the papers with shaking hands. Amos took them carefully, his weathered face brightening as he read. Hope kindled in his eyes, making him look years younger. Then his expression darkened, and he sat heavily on an old trunk. "What's wrong?" Clara asked, moving to his side. "Isn't this proof the land is yours?" "It should be," he said heavily. "But without the official government seal, no court will recognize it." He ran a callous hand over his face. The seal was kept by Preacher Matthews, who witnessed these signatures. But he left town years ago, ran off after some scandal about mission funds. Clara studied the document again. "But surely this is something the map, the signatures it shows you, didn't just claim this land? It was given to you proper and legal." "Maybe." Amos's voice held a hint of the hope that had shown earlier. "At the least it proves there was a formal agreement, more than my word against theirs." He looked at Clara with newfound appreciation. "Your sharp eyes might have found us something valuable here." "We should hide it somewhere safe," Clara said. "Somewhere dry where the paper won't spoil." Amos nodded. "There's a hollow space behind the hearthstone. I've kept important things there before." They climbed down from the loft together, Amos carrying the precious packet. Clara watched as he carefully removed two stones from the fireplace's facing, revealing a small cavity. He wrapped the papers in fresh oilcloth before tucking them away. Outside, snow had begun falling in thick, lazy flakes. Clara stirred the soup hanging over the fire while Amos secured the stones back in place. The familiar task kept her hands busy while her mind turned over their discovery. "Thank you," Amos said quietly, coming to stand beside her. The firelight caught the silver in his hair. "For what?" "For looking closer when most wouldn't. For caring enough to search," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "For making this place worth fighting for." Clara's heart swelled at his words. For the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she felt truly needed. Not just useful, but indispensable. The feeling warmed her more than any fire could. They ate their supper in comfortable silence, watching the snow pile up outside the window. The wind whistled through the pines, but inside the cabin was warm and secure. Clara's eyes kept straying to the hearthstones behind which lay a small piece of hope for their future. The deed might not be complete, but it was something to hold on to, something to fight with, and together they would find a way to keep this home they were building. This life they had stumbled into, but now couldn't imagine living without. The days grew shorter as November deepened, the sun barely climbing above the mountain peaks before sliding away again. Morning frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows, warning of the harsh winter ahead. Clara and Amos fell into a steady rhythm, working side by side to prepare for the coming months. "We'll need twice that would split before the deep snows," Amos said one morning, pointing to the growing pile behind the cabin. Clara nodded, already wearing the leather work gloves he'd given her. She'd gotten stronger these past weeks, learning to swing them all with precision rather than force. They worked in companionable silence, the sharp crack of splitting wood echoing through the valley. When Clara's arms tired, she switched to stacking the pieces against the cabin wall, building a neat wall of fuel that would keep them warm through the darkest days. Inside, strips of venison hung from the rafters, curing in the smoke from the hearth. Clara had learned to salt the meat just right, preserving their winter stores while Amos checked his trap lines. The familiar scent of wood smoke and leather filled the cabin as she worked on repairing harnesses, her careful stitches strengthening worn spots in the traces. When time came to trade pelts in town, Clara joined Amos on the wagon seat. The morning air bit sharp and clean their breath, forming clouds in the early light. The road wound down through stands of pine, their branches heavy with snow. At the mercantile, Clara helped unload the furs, while Amos negotiated with the owner. She noticed Mrs. Peterson, the minister's wife, watching from near the dry goods shelf. Instead of turning away, Clara offered a warm smile. "How are you managing up there in the high country?" Mrs. Peterson asked, stepping closer. Her voice held genuine concern rather than judgment. "Better than I expected," Clara answered honestly. "The work is hard but satisfying, and the view of the valley at sunrise, well, it takes your breath." away. Soon other women gathered around curious about life in the mountain cabin. Clara shared stories of learning to split wood and preserve meat of the peace she'd found in the rhythm of frontier life. She asked after their families in return, remembering details about sick children and new babies. "You must join us for the quilting circle," Mrs. Peterson said. "We meet every other Wednesday at the church." Clara glanced at Amos, who was watching the exchange. While counting out coffee beans, he gave a slight nod, the corners of his mouth lifting. "I'd like that very much," Clara said, warmth spreading through her chest. They loaded their supplies, coffee, sugar, salt, and yards of sturdy fabric, into the wagon. Clara noticed how the townspeople nodded to Amos, now offering greetings, where before they'd turned away. Her heart swelled with quiet pride. The next afternoon, as Clara kneaded bread, familiar voices called from outside. Through the window, she saw two hawks and his wife, Morning Star, approaching on horseback, their daughter riding double behind her mother. Amos welcomed them in from the cold. Morning Star held out a bundle wrapped in clean cloth, dried choke cherries, their deep purple color promising sweetness. "For trade," she said, her English clear and confident. "We heard you have good flour." Clara measured out the flour generously, adding an extra scoop for good measure. She invited them to sit while she steeped tea, listening intently, as Morning Star spoke of gathering the berries in late summer, of teaching her daughter the old ways of preserving them. Two hawks told stories of the valley, how his grandfather had shown the first settlers where to find clean water, how different families had learned to share the hunting grounds. Clara found herself leaning forward, absorbing every detail about the land they now called home. Amos sat quietly by the fire, but Clara caught him watching her with soft eyes as she asked thoughtful questions about UT traditions when their visitors departed. Morning Star clasped Clara's hand warmly. "You understand how to listen," she said. "That is good." Later that week, returning from another trip to town, Clara and Amos took the long way home in the sleigh. Fresh snow had fallen, muffling the world in white silence. The runners cut smooth tracks through the drifts as their horse plodded steadily uphill. "Folks in town seemed different now," Amos said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper or welcoming, like Clara adjusted the blanket across their laps. "People just needed a chance to know you better. Been a long time since I felt ... double quotes." He paused, searching for words. "Since I felt connected to folks both in town and out here." He glanced toward the distant peaks where their Ute neighbors lived. "Reckon that's your doing." "Sometimes people just need a bridge," Clara said softly. "Someone to help them see past their differences." Amos nodded, his shoulder warm against hers as they climbed toward home. The sleigh bells jingled softly, a cheerful counterpoint to the hushed winter afternoon, and Clara felt peace settle over her like the fresh snow blanketing the valley. By late February, winter's grip had softened just enough to let hope peek through. Inside the snug cabin, Clara and Amos had found their own gentle pattern, like a well-worn path through fresh snow. Each morning they shared breakfast at the Rafune table, steam rising from tin cups of coffee as they planned their day. Evenings brought them together again, the cabin warm with lamplight and the rich aroma of whatever Clara had, bubbling in the iron pot after supper. They settled into their evening ritual. Clara would clear the dishes while Amos banked the fire. Then they'd sit close to the hearth's glow. The family Bible lay open across Clara's lap, its pages soft from years of turning. Her clear voice filled the cabin as she read, while Amos listened intently sometimes, nodding at familiar verses. These quiet moments drew them closer, sharing not just space but spirit. One particularly cold afternoon, Clara heard boots stomping snow from the porch earlier than usual. Amos stepped inside, bringing a swirl of frigid air with him. His cheeks were red from the cold, but his eyes sparkled with something more than just winter's bite. "Oh, trap lines all set," he said, unwinding his wool scarf. "Found time to make something for you." From inside his coat, he pulled out a wooden spoon smooth as silk and gracefully curved. The handle bore delicate carved leaves, each one distinct and lovely. Clara ran her fingers over the careful work. "It's beautiful," she whispered, touched by the hours of thought and care worked into every detail. She looked up to find Amos watching her face, his expression soft in the fading daylight. That evening they sat closer than usual by the fire, their shoulders touching as Clara read from Psalms. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and driving snow against the logs. But inside, warmth bloomed between them like early spring flowers. Clara felt the change in their marriage. No longer just words spoken before the minister, but something deep and true growing in their hearts. As she closed the Bible, Amos took her hand. His palm was rough from work but gentle against her skin. They sat in comfortable silence watching the fire dance while the storm raged beyond their walls. Clara realized she'd never felt so safe, so cherished as she did in these quiet moments. With Amos. 3 days later, a knock at their door revealed Mrs. Peterson wrapped in her heaviest shawl. "You're both needed in town," she announced, eyes twinkling. "Urgent business at the barn." Clara and Amos exchanged puzzled glances but hitched up the sleigh. The ride to town was quick, their horse eager in the crisp air. As they approached the Thompsons' big barn, warm light spilled from its windows, and the sound of a fiddle drifted through the evening air. Inside, they found the town gathered, women bearing steaming plates of food, men with their instruments, children darting between the hay bales that had been arranged for seating. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a golden glow over the scene. "A proper welcome," Mrs. Peterson declared, pressing hot cider into their hands. "They're long overdue." The fiddle struck up a lively tune joined by guitar and someone keeping time on a wooden crate. Clara felt Amos's hand tighten around hers as neighbors approached with warm greetings and plates of food. She watched in wonder as his usual reserve melted away, replaced by genuine smiles and easy conversation. When the music called for dancing, Amos surprised her by leading her onto the cleared floor. He wasn't as practiced as some, but his steps were sure and his arms held her steady. Clara's cheeks ached from smiling as they twirled among their neighbors, her skirts swishing against the rough barn boards. Through it all, Amos kept hold of her hand, as if afraid she might slip away like a dream. They danced until the lanterns burned low, shared stories over fresh baked bread and rich stew, and accepted the community's belated but heartfelt wedding wishes. The moon was high when they finally started home, the sleigh runners cutting smooth, tracks through new-fallen snow. Stars blazed overhead in the crystal-clearer sky, and their horses' breath formed clouds in the still air. Clara nestled close to Amos under the thick buffalo robe, content in a way she'd never thought possible when she'd first stepped down from that stagecoach. Amos guided the horse carefully along the familiar trail, then spoke so softly, Clara almost missed it. "Never thought I'd be this happy again." The words hung in the starlit air between them, precious as gold. Clara squeezed his arm gently, her heart too full for speech. Above them, the stars winked like distant lanterns, blessing their journey home. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Clara stirred a pot of oatmeal, humming softly. Her feet still ached pleasantly from dancing, and the memory of Amos's words under the stars brought warmth to her cheeks. The peaceful moments shattered at the sound of approaching hoof beats. Through the window, she spotted two riders making their way up the snowy path. One wore the sharp suit of a railroad man, the other the badge of a deputy. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her apron. Amos opened the door before they could knock, his expression guarded. The railroad agent dismounted, first his polished boots incongruous against the rough mountain terrain. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, his voice clipped and cold. "I'm Theodore Burke from the Denver and Pacific Railroad. We've come about the property matter." The deputy hung back, looking uncomfortable as he fingered his badge. Burke pulled a document from his leather satchel, waving it like a weapon. "We've received information that you're in possession of a supposedly valid deed. Our sources suggest it's a forgery." Clara's chest tightened as she moved to stand beside Amos. The agent's eyes flicked dismissively over her before returning to Amos. "That deed's honest as daylight," Amos said quietly, but Clara heard the tension in his voice, signed proper by Chief Walking Bear himself. Burke's lip curled. "Without an official government seal, it's worthless, and we have reason to believe you know that." He took a step closer. "In fact, our investigation suggests you've been trying to obtain the seal illegally." "That's a lie," Clara burst out, her cheeks flushing with anger. The agent ignored her. "The seal disappeared with that disgraced preacher, Reverend Matthews." "Did it not the same man who witnessed your supposed agreement?" His smile was sharp as a knife, convenient that he vanished before the territory office could validate any of his paperwork. Amos's jaw tightened. "Matthews was an honest man. Whatever drove him to leave was guilt," Burke cut in. "And now he's hiding up in these mountains, somewhere, probably with that missing seal." Rather suspicious that you chose this particular plot of land so close to his last known whereabouts? The deputy shifted in his saddle, clearly wishing to be elsewhere. Burke pulled another paper from his satchel. Here's the situation, Hargrove. You have 1 week to vacate the premises. After that, you'll be arrested for squatting on railroad property. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. 1 week in the depths of winter, she gripped Amos's arm. If you have any sense, Burke continued, you'll be gone before then. The railroad doesn't take kindly to thieves and forgers. He turned to go, then paused. Oh, and if you happen to know where Matthews is hiding ... well, that information might buy you some grace. Period. They watched in tense silence as the two men rode away. As soon as they were out of sight, Clara hurried inside to grab the deed from its hiding place. Her hands shook as she spread it on the table. It's real, she insisted, tracing the careful signatures. Every word of it is true. We can't let them. Take everything you've built. Amos stood by the hearth, staring into the flames, his jaw set in a hard line. The firelight deepened the worry lines around his eyes. We have to find Reverend Matthews, Clara said, straightening her spine. He's the only one who can prove this deed is genuine. Clara Amos's voice was heavy. The mountains are treacherous. This time of year, storms blow up without warning. Even if Matthews is up there somewhere, then we'll find him together. Clara moved to stand before him, taking his rough hands in hers. This is our home now, not just yours. I won't watch them take it without a fight. Amos studied her face for a long moment. She saw the worry there, the fear not for himself, she realized, but for her. The passes are deep with snow, he said softly. Could be wolves, mountain lions, and if we don't find him ... we will. Clara squeezed his hands. You know these mountains better than anyone, and I may be new to frontier life, but I'm stronger than I look. She managed a small smile. We're in this together now. Something shifted in Amos's expression. Pride, perhaps, or wonder. He nodded slowly. We'll need supplies. Warm gear. It'll take careful planning. Then we'd best get started, Clara said firmly. She turned to the cabinet, mind already racing through what they'd need. Behind her, she heard Amos moving with new purpose, gathering maps and gear. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick flakes swirling against the window glass. The mountain peaks loomed dark against the white sky, holding their secrets close. Somewhere up there, Clara thought, was the key to saving their home. They just had to be brave enough and determined enough to find it. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Clara's fingers flew over torn canvas packs, her needle flashing in the firelight as she reinforced worn seams. Amos worked in the barn, coating the sleigh runners with pine tar and checking every leather strap for signs of weakness. They couldn't risk a breakdown in the deep wilderness. We'll need more dried meat, Amma said, coming in from the cold. His breath made clouds in the cabin air. Clara nodded, already laying out strips of venison to pack. She'd been drying extra since autumn, a habit from leaner times that now seemed like providence. I found these in the loft, she said, pulling out 2 pairs of thick wool socks. Her knitting needles clicked late into the evening as she darned small holes. Every piece of gear had to be sound. The mountain wouldn't forgive careless preparation. Amos brought in his old Hound rifle, cleaning it with practiced care. The weapon was worn but reliable like its owner. I need this, he said quietly. Not just for game, Clara understood. The winter peaks held more dangers than cold and snow. They packed with careful thought dried apples and cornbread coffee beans, salt pork, and hard cheese. Extra blankets went in next, along with dry tinder and spare flint. Clara tucked a small Bible into her pocket, running her fingers over its worn leather cover. The evening before they left, Amos spread his maps on the table. Yellowed paper crackled as his callous finger traced possible routes. Matthews was partial to the high country, he explained. Like to be close to heaven, he'd say. Even after ... everything. Clara leaned closer, studying the terrain lines. Tell me about him, she asked softly. About when he helped you with the deed. Amos was quiet for a moment, lost in memory. He was a good man, he finally said. Understood that promises matter, even ones made to mountain folk and Indians. When Chief Walking Bear agreed to let me settle here, Matthews didn't hesitate to witness it. Said it was God's work helping peace grow between peoples. What happened to him, town turned on him. Accusations about mission funds, missing donations, nothing proven. But Amos shook his head. Rumors can kill a preacher quick as any bullet. He left one night. Some said he went mad with shame, headed for the high peaks to live like a hermit. Others thought he died in that first winter. But sometimes ... he paused. Sometimes I'd see smoke way up where nobody should be. Never investigated. Figured a man's entitled to his solitude. They rose before dawn when the stars still glittered like ice chips in the black sky. The cabin was cold, the fire banked low. They moved quietly, donning layers of wool and leather. Clara's hands shook slightly as she tied her bootlaces, but her voice was steady when she said, "I'm ready." The sleigh runners creaked in the bitter air as Amos loaded their gear. Their breath frosted and the snow squeaked underfoot. Clara took one last look at the cabin, their home, before climbing aboard. Amos clicked to the horses and they moved into the darkness. Morning crept over the mountains as they followed the creek valley. The going was slow. Deep drifts forced them to stop, often strapping on snowshoes to break trail for the horses. Clara's muscles burned, but she didn't complain. Each step took them closer to saving their home. By afternoon, heavy clouds rolled in, bringing early darkness. "We'll camp here," Amos said, indicating a sheltered spot near the frozen creek. The wind had sculpted the snow into deep curves. Offering some protection from the bitter gusts, they worked together to make camp. Movements efficient from practice. Clara gathered wood while Amos tended the horses. Soon a small fire cast orange light on the snow walls around them. They huddled close under buffalo robes and wool blankets, sharing coffee and hard bread. The preacher, Clara, said softly, "Sparks spiral up toward the stars." "You said he was kind. Tell me more." Amos poked the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. He understood the land, he said slowly, respected the old agreements. When I brought him the deed, explained how Chief Walking Bear had granted me settlement rights for helping during the bad winter. Matthews didn't laugh like some would. He listened, said any promise made in good faith deserved to be honored. They fell silent, listening to the pop of burning wood and the distant cry of a nightbird. The cold crept closer, forcing them to feed the fire more often. Clara pulled the blankets tighter, grateful for Amos's solid warmth beside her. Morning brought a bitter dawn. Frost rimed everything, their blankets, the horses' mans, even their eyelashes. Clara's fingers were clumsy with cold as they broke camp, but she worked steadily. The sun rose into a crystal clearer sky, the snow blindingly bright dot. As they prepared to move out, Clara saw Amos studying the high peaks ahead. His expression was troubled but determined. She touched his arm gently. "Well, find him," she said. The unspoken words hung between them. "We have two." Amos nodded, helping her into the sleigh. The horses moved forward, their breath streaming in the frigid air. Ahead, the mountains waited silent and white, guarding their secrets beneath the winter sky. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow when Clara spotted something dark against the white. She squinted, then grabbed Amos's sleeve. "There by that fallen pine is that." Amos reined the horses to a stop, standing in the sleigh for a better look. "Person," he said grimly without hesitation. He grabbed a rope and waded through the deep snow. Clara's heart pounded as she watched Amos reach the still form. A man lay half buried in the drift, his pack frozen beside him. Amos checked his neck, then called back, "He's alive, barely breathing, but alive." Together they managed to haul the stranger back to the sleigh. His hands were a frightening shade of gray-white and iced his beard. Clara recognized the signs of severe frostbite from her father's warnings about winter travel. "Needs shelter," Amos said, scanning the terrain. "Can't treat him proper in the open." He pointed to a cluster of pines. Their winds carved out a hollow. They made camp with urgent efficiency. Clara cleared snow while Amos strung a canvas shelter. The stranger didn't stir as they wrapped him in blankets near the hastily built fire. "His hands," Clara whispered, gentle as she examined the gray flesh. Their frozen solid. Amos nodded grimly. "Start some broth warming. I'll work on getting blood flowing back to his limbs." He began carefully rubbing the man's arms and legs through the blankets, using steady pressure to avoid damaging the frozen tissue. Clara melted snow in their biggest pot, adding dried meat and the precious handful of dried vegetables she'd packed. The rich smell soon filled their makeshift camp. She watched Amos work his big hands, moving with surprising gentleness as he tried to coax warmth back into the stranger's body. An hour passed before the man's eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak, but only a croak emerged. Clara held a cup of warm broth to his lips. Small sips, she murmured. Don't rush. Color gradually returned to his face as the broth worked its magic. Name's Peterson, he managed finally. Lost my bearings in the storm 3 days back. Ran out of food yesterday. He looked at his hands, still gray, but beginning to show painful signs of thawing. Reckon I'd have died if you hadn't come along. God puts us where we're needed, Clara said softly, offering more broth. Can you tell us how you came to be out here? Peterson grimaced as feeling returned to his extremities. Trapping's been poor in my usual spots. Heard there might be beaver in the high country. Met an odd fellow up there a few weeks back. Living in an old mining shack, if you can believe it. Real religious type, always quoting scripture. Amos's head snapped up. This man was he tall, white beard. That's him. Called himself Matthews or Matt, something like that. Seemed educated despite living like a hermit. Shared his fire one night. Told me about some good trapping spots. Peterson shook his head. Should have stayed there instead of pushing on in the storm. Clara and Amos exchanged meaningful looks. Where exactly was this shack? Amos asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Peterson described the location, a day's journey off their planned route. Higher up in the peaks where the air grew thin and the wind never truly stopped. Clara saw the conflict in Amos's eyes. The detour would cost them precious time, but this was their first solid lead. We have to try, she said quietly. We've come too far not to. Amos nodded slowly. First light tomorrow, we'll get Peterson down to the valley where he can find help. Then we'll head up to the shack. They spent the night taking turns tending the fire and watching over Peterson. His hands and feet were painful now, a good sign that meant blood was returning. Clara wrapped them carefully in clean cloth, remembering her mother's lessons about treating frostbite. Why are you folks up here? Peterson asked during one of his lucid moments. Ain't exactly pleasure-traveling weather. Clara shared a look with Amos before answering. Looking for someone who might help us keep our home. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. Risky time for mountain travel, but I reckon some things are worth the risk. He fell silent watching the fire. Thank you, he said finally. Most folks wouldn't have stopped. Would have been easier to ride on by. No, Amos said firmly. It wouldn't have been easier. Not really. He looked at Clara. Something soft in his expression, sometimes doing right, is the only choice that lets you sleep at night. Clara smiled, warmth flooding her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They had lost a day of travel. True, the railroad's deadline loomed closer with every sunrise. But watching Peterson slowly recover, seeing the gentle way Amos cared for a stranger in need, she knew they'd made the right choice. Some things were worth more than time. Tomorrow they would face the higher peaks following Peterson's directions to the mining shack. But tonight they had saved a life. Clara tucked the blanket tighter around Peterson's shoulders and settled in for her. Watch at peace with their decision. The afternoon sun hung low in the western sky when they finally spotted the mining shack. Smoke threaded weakly from its crooked chimney, barely visible against the gray clouds. Amos helped Clara through the deep snow, their boots crunching with each step. Ready? He asked softly, his hand warm on her elbow. Clara nodded, adjusting her shawl against the bitter wind. The door creaked open at Amos' knock, revealing a dim interior lit by a sputtering fire. In its meager light sat a gaunt figure, the ex-preacher. Wrapped in threadbare blankets, his hollow eyes widened with recognition. Amos Hargrove, he whispered, then looked at Clara. And you must be the wife. Folks down in town spoke of. Shame clouded his weathered face and he turned away. You shouldn't have come all this way. I'm not worth seeking out. Mr. Matthews, Amos said, his voice steady and respectful. We need your help. The railroad's trying to take our land, the same land you helped secure with your witness mark. Years ago, Clara stepped forward, her heart aching at the man's obvious distress. Sir, we all carry burdens, she said gently, but that doesn't erase the good deeds we've done. You helped my husband once, gave him a chance at a real home. That kindness deserves to be finished. Matthew's shoulders shook. Kindness, he said bitterly. I haven't shown true kindness since my shame drove me from the pulpit. You showed it then, Clara insisted, and you can show it now. She knelt beside his chair, her eyes level with his. The man who witnessed that day's still inside you, still capable of doing right. Silence filled the shack, broken only by the pop of pine nuts in the fire. Then Matthews rose, slowly crossing to a shelf where a battered tin box sat. His hands trembled as he opened it. "I kept it," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Don't rightly know why. Maybe the Lord knew you'd need it." From the box, he withdrew a brass sealed a missing government stamp that could validate Amos' deed. Tears tracked down his sunken cheeks as he pressed it into Clara's hands. "I'll write out a statement to swearing to the deed's authenticity." He looked at Clara, something of his former dignity returning to his bearing. "Your kindness, ma'am. It reminds me of who I once was, who I still could be." As Matthews carefully penned his statement, Clara squeezed Amos's hand. In the growing darkness outside, snow began to fall again. But inside the shack, hope burned brighter than any fire. The journey home felt lighter despite the heavy snow. Clara kept the precious seal and statement wrapped carefully in oilcloth, tucked close to her heart inside her coat. Every few hours she would pat the bundle, reassuring herself it was still there. The March sun grew stronger with each passing day, turning the crusty snow into slush. By mid-afternoon, water dripped from pine boughs, and icicles shrank visibly along the cabin eaves as they approached Elk Fork. Patches of brown earth peeked through white drifts like promises of spring. "Look there," Amma said, pointing to a flock of returning geese overhead. "Even they know winter's losing its grip." Clara smiled, remembering how different everything had looked when she'd first arrived on that cold winter day. The town that had once seemed so unwelcoming now felt familiar, almost friendly. As they drove their wagon down the muddy Main Street dot at the courthouse, a small crowd gathered. Word had spread fast in the small town. Clara noticed even Mr. Dalton hanging at the edge of the group, though he quickly looked away when she caught his eye inside. Judge Peterson adjusted his spectacles as he examined their documents. The small office smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Clara held her breath as his weathered fingers traced over the deed lingering on the fresh government seal and Matthew's sworn statement. His sworn statement. "Everything appears to be in order," the judge announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The original deed, properly witnessed and now properly sealed, stands as legal and binding." He looked up at Amos. "The railroad will have to find another route, Mr. Hardgrove. This land is yours fair and square." A cheer went up from those gathered outside when Amos and Clara emerged. Several townsfolk patted Amos on the back, while others smiled warmly at Clara. The victory felt like it belonged to everyone somehow. That evening, they sat across from each other at their cabin table. Clara reached across the worn wooden surface, taking Amos's callous hand in hers. "Our home," she said softly, feeling the truth of those words deep in her heart. Amos squeezed her fingers gently. The firelight caught the moisture in his eyes as he nodded too, moved for words. Outside their window, the last light of day painted the snowy valley in shades of pink and gold, and somewhere in the distance a lone wolf called out to welcome the coming night. Easter Sunday brought with it a warmth that seemed to wake the whole valley. Morning sunlight sparkled off the last patches of snow, and fresh green buds dotted the aspen branches. The cabin window stood open to welcome the spring breeze, carrying the sweet scent of Clara's baking through every room dot inside. Clara hummed hymns while she worked, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out her third batch of biscuits. The ham rubbed with brown sugar and cloves filled the cabin with its rich aroma. On the rough-hewn sideboard, 3 golden-crusted apple pies cooled their spicy sweetness, promising the perfect end to the feast. Amos had spent the morning setting up extra benches and tables, some borrowed from neighbors, others crafted from fresh-cut pine-making room for all who would come. By midday, wagon wheels and horses' hooves could be heard approaching. Townsfolk arrived bearing dishes to share. Mrs. Peterson's pickled beans, the mercantile owner's wife's preserves, and fresh churned butter from the Miller farm. The youth families came on foot, bringing dried berries and fresh-caught trout. The cabin soon filled with the happy sounds of gathering. Children darted between adults' legs, playing with carved wooden toys Amos had made. The minister led them all in prayer, his words bridging English and Ute, thanking the Creator for new beginnings and gathered family. Laughter rang out often as stories were shared across loaded plates. Clara watched with joy as Amos, once so solitary, joined in the telling of winter tales. His deep voice carried across the table as he described their mountain journey. Making the children lean forward with wide eyes, they sang hymns as the afternoon light mellowed voices rising in harmony. Amazing Grace floated out across the valley, followed by other beloved songs. Even those who didn't know all the words hummed along, caught up in the spirit of celebration. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, the setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold, touching everything with gentle fire. The air held that special sweetness that comes only in early spring, full of promise and new life. Amos turned to Clara, his weathered face soft in the fading light. "You didn't just save my land," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me a life again." Clara leaned into his solid warmth, feeling the strength of his arm as it circled her shoulders. Behind them, the cabin glowed with lamplight and echoed with the voices of their last remaining guests, their new family brought together by love and trust in the simple sharing of bread. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day. Your day.